Apperstein, a doctoral student here at Dartmouth, who has who's done extensive work learning different geophysical techniques and done work with various research teams around the country and around the world. But I'm really pleased today he's going to bring some of that research and some of that expertise to examining village sites in the Upper Connecticut River Valley, right, Jon? Yeah. So with that, please welcome Jon Apperstein, to tell us about what he's been up to here in our neighborhood. Thanks, Jon.
Thank you guys so much for coming out today. I really appreciate it. And even though this is the title, I do have to give a shout out to my students from New Zealand, where I was this winter. When Nathaniel reached out to me about giving a talk here, I was trying to come up with a good title, and I told the students what I was potentially going to be talking about. And one of the students, Katie, came up with this title, and they all loved it, so I had to go with it. And today, my hope is to still definitely talk and focus on the extent of maize agriculture and what we know about it in the Northeast. But really, I've decided to also kind of focus on to what I know best, which is the geophysical surveys that we've been completing in this area. So as Nathaniel mentioned, I'm a PhD student in ecology, evolution, environment, and society right here at Dartmouth College. And kind of part of my main dissertation problem is really interested in these kind of three main questions about this region. And really the three main debates that are happening, which is why is there a lack of woodland settlement villages, like indigenous villages within this area? The great maize debate about the lack or the confusion on when maize actually gets introduced to this area, and kind of the preservation issues around maize in this area. And then three, how this actually directly interacts with our current understandings of conservation and our ideas of ecological restoration, trying to kind of recreate the landscape prior to European contact. And so really this is kind of where the crux of kind of my dissertation research is, and kind of where my research is too, is through what's known as the anthropogenic paradigm, which is directly involved with the extent of the possibilities of maize agriculture and agriculture in general prior to European contact here in the Northeast. This is well talked about in Changes in the Land by William Cronin, as well as been discussed very recently in Nature as well. Although there's been a lot of kind of rebuttals and responses to this paper here that I've shown, it's clear that our understandings about really what's happening here prior to European contact is much more still up to debate, where there's questions on the remnants of even charcoal burning technologies. The pollen record is different, and the ethnohistoric record is also different as well. And so this is kind of what was really kind of spurred this, is that even though I've been really interested in woodland villages, I've been really involved with reading kind of the ethnohistoric and literature that's been going on. So this is just kind of some of my notes of whenever I would try to read an area where they talk about a specific site and specific date and the ethnohistoric record where there's maize, I kind of just was starting to pinpoint it on Google Earth. So this isn't even like some of the better GIS skills. This was literally just kind of from my notes. And you can kind of see, there's a real concentration here in southern New England, but you even have some really far extents that you have from Cabot up in the kind of St. Lawrence River, that area too, as well as even far extensive corns in Meductic as well. Now, not all of these are archaeological in context, but a lot of these have really strong dates around 17th century. All the ones in green here are examples where we have had archaeological investigations that show evidence of extensive maize agriculture. And so kind of the first kind of form of evidence that we've been kind of working on to try to answer this is that we need to have the corn itself, which is through macro remains. So this is kind of a rough example of our first edition for our research project on flotation. We have a much better flotation tank now that we've made, but this is the best photo that I could see of us like actively doing it. So it's kind of tough with a lot of water to take photographs of this. But what's really kind of important and what's critical about my research area, which is right here in the Upper River Valley, is that we're very lucky because Dick Bovair collected maize kernels up at the Ingalls site too, and it's the oldest and directly dated kernel remains we have for entire New England. So we're in a really special place where we kind of have kind of the oldest evidence of actual macro remains within the Archaeological Northeast. And then it sort of kind of goes to the next kind of form of evidence that we have that's been well discussed, which is on our understanding of phytoliths. Now, phytoliths is kind of a newer thing. It's been discussed in many of the reviews on maize agriculture and the reviews of archaeological maize within the area. Hart and Lovis talked about it in 2013, claiming that there's been extensive work on phytoliths. But actually, if you look at the phytolith published literature within New England, there's actually only 3, maybe 4 publications, if you include one of Quebec, on phytolith work. And one of those papers is just to say, like, hey, we can identify the phytoliths and like what corn, bean, squash look like as phytoliths as well. That's in Current Northeast Paleontobotany Part 2. But what I want to bring it up is one of the big kind of confusing issues that we see within our understanding of maize agriculture here in the Northeast, which are some of the really early dates that we have for these maize phytoliths, which showcase maybe about 2,000 years prior to our current understanding of when maize kind of comes in. Very, very early maize dates. Now, this doesn't suggest that like they're growing extensive maize here too, but this whole paper called Mind the Gap really brings in a big question about why we're having very early dates for these maize phytoliths, and seemingly a large gap before we start seeing all these macro remains happening much later in the archaeological record. This is still something that I think is very kind of like new and definitely needs a lot more work to understand when we're seeing these phytoliths. But unfortunately, really right now, it only looks like Dotzel from University of Connecticut's really been the main person working on this. And this is also kind of a plea for everyone who's kind of interested in wanting to know more, like interested in this research, like please do more of this. This is really important. We have started to kind of look at it. We have a colleague right here at Dartmouth too that did some phytolith work for us that I'm really excited and still trying to untangle exactly what it can mean and infer. But this is definitely still, even though it's been written about, even in earlier 1990s reports of stuff too, this is very unpublished stuff too. People are not really engaging with the phytolith remains. And what's nice about the phytolith remains too is they preserve much nicer than some of the macro remains due to our soil samples. Yeah, so the palynology, so just talking about other evidence for kind of extensive maize agriculture, as I already mentioned this paper here earlier before, where they were trying to look about this anthropogenic paradigm of the use of fire prior to European contact for clearing fields. So in the ethnohistoric record, Samuel Champlain mentions about this idea of controlled burnings. Delcourt and Delcourt have written extensively in Eastern North America about indigenous burnings of the area. But if you actually look at the sediment coils, the charcoal samples, this is not evident, at least from these surveys that are found here. What's making it even more confusing is if you actually look at even some of the pollen samples that look beyond just charcoal burning, is that you see not a very clear change in the forest makeup, which has been well known since the 1980s with Nichols' Human Ecology of the Northeast. But what you can see here too as well is that none of these things, both these ones too, are talking about the introduction of maize pollen within the pollen record, which to me it seems to be very confusing because we know that pollen itself is dispersed through wind. And so we would expect that if there were to be an area that's not a river or a lake or ponds, we'd expect to see the maize end up into the soil record prior to European contact. Now, this paper I like to focus too because it's using 1600 as kind of the date. A lot of these pollen samples and stuff use 1800 as the date for kind of understanding prior to European contact and impacts on the landscape itself. But I think it's really important we're setting that we know that Europeans have been engaging and interacting in this landscape much longer. And I would argue that we could probably see things even much earlier than that as well. But when talking to some of my other colleagues who've been doing sediment, for example, stuff too, they're not actively looking at kind of this moment in time too, and specifically looking for maize pollen. So just to kind of wrap it up, we have very early phytolith examples. We have really cool examples of corn here in the Upper Valley as well. But when it comes to the pollen record and the extensive work within pollen and kind of like earth science fields, we actually don't see maize in the pollen record, which is really kind of a gap and kind of is part of the great maize debate that we see for this area. Diet, another form of evidence. So we have a few examples that this has been kind of written about in a lot of the reviews of 3 kind of known skeletal examples of stable isotopes that looked at diet prior to European contact to try to see when intaking more maize, since it's a C4 plant, you'll have different examples of carbon 13 versus 14 in your skeletal remains. So this is kind of interesting because there's very few actually examples. In Hart Lovis's review in 2013, they actually claimed that, oh yeah, we're actually seeing an intake, that there is actually a clear diet in the skeletal remains of a diet that's heavily on maize. But there's other examples. The only other one too from Little and Schoeniger says that is not the case at all, which is very interesting because this is from Nantucket, where we know that there's archaeological corn hills and actually extensive agriculture that's been preserved. So this is a really kind of break within our understanding of maybe what our diet is a good answer, or what kind of parallel to understanding what people are eating and consuming in the past. And unfortunately, we haven't seen, like, there hasn't been any new, or at least understand that I've seen, people working on diet or stable isotope stuff on skeletal remains, especially human skeletal remains, in this region. Other people who are doing it in the Great Lakes have been kind of switching from human skeletal remains to animals and looking at garden hunting and trying to see if some of the zooarchaeological remains found in the archaeological record are eating maize as their primary diet. And this is actually well known in like the Lake Ontario region and kind of within some of the Haudenosaunee communities and Algonquin communities on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes. So this hasn't been done here, but I think is also kind of leaves a really great option and project that we can kind of relook at some of the zooarch remains found at archaeological sites here in the woodland period to see what these animals are eating, if they're actually foraging on domesticated crops. And so, yeah, so now kind of one of the big questions too is that, now we have that the phytolith examples show early cone. The pollen shows no corn. But the ethnohistoric record here shows extensive corn. In fact, both in the British and French early colonial records, we see extensive corn being grown in southern New England. The French actually claim that it's happening much farther up into Maine, and then the British claim that it's really kind of like the mouth of the Connecticut where this stops. But I really think it's important. We've all probably who've worked have seen this map from Silverstone Plain, where you not only see cornfields, but also one thing that I really like, which is important to my work, is the differences between architectural styles. So if you look at letter E, you can kind of see these conical wigwam type things in this longhouse as well. So for me, this also shows a really kind of interesting kind of scope into just the diversity of house structures that we could see during the woodland period. And then so finally, so there's a lot of reviews in the that are published literature on the reviews on the introduction of corn, looking at all these kind of examples throughout time. And it's something that I've read all of them, and it's kind of interesting how very little has actually changed throughout time about the models that are stuff too. But one thing that I've always thought was really interesting is the ignoring of kind of these early 1920s features that we've known about in the 19th and 20th century about these corn hills that are happening. So this is Delaware and Wilder 1920s. It's a really awesome, if everyone should check it out, it's free, available, it's online. This shows both the Assonet Neck as well as Northampton, Massachusetts. Sorry, the Massachusetts got cut off. But what you're seeing here is what's been interpreted as, and been tested by them too, as indigenous cornhill agriculture. So these are roughly a foot, 2 feet and sub 2 of buildup areas where they would be growing corn on. And these features have been well talked about in the 19th century, being all over New England. This is also important because in Champlain's own writings, he's talking about how there's actually differences in styles in cornhill production, both in Maine and in southern New England as well. So not only do we see a diversity in housing, we also see a diversity in also the forms of agriculture being happening on the surface. We actually, as a group, went out to Northampton, to the smallest area where these things should have been preserved left. And unfortunately, doing our own surveys, we were not able to find any still remaining. But what's interesting is the only response to this paper in the 1920s was another person who mentions, hey, how come they didn't talk about the other corn hills found in on the Connecticut River farther south? So it wasn't like this was a very contentious argument. People were like, yes, these are well accepted, and really excited that these were still preserved as visible features. Now, these are also seen in the archaeological record too. So this is an example in Cape Cod where they found a series of these things actually buried underneath sediment that were interpreted as these corn hills. And I just wanted to kind of showcase for us too, who are doing these kind of geophysical surveys, this was really important because we know these aren't just visible surfaces, and in some ways could also be buried as well. As I mentioned, LiDAR, we did a small LiDAR survey in Northampton, Massachusetts to try to find these features. One of the big issues with these corn hills is they're incredibly small. So the resolution for LiDAR to actually pick them up if they still exist is really too small for even the public section to kind of work on. But Connecticut, if anyone's ever seen, there's been a lot of work on the kind of Connecticut DEMs and LiDAR. They have the best public LiDAR in the Northeast available, and they have about 1 foot resolution. And so I kind of went in and tried to look at some of these known areas where they're supposed to be. Unfortunately, the resolution isn't great, but you can see this is both the same area in Mohegan, Connecticut, where you can kind of see this kind of granular background. I'm not saying that these are corn hills, but I think that with higher resolution and better work, that it wouldn't be impossible to still find these things visible on the surface. Other examples, so we know that these raised beds, so these are ridged fields, not corn hills, which is a different style architecture, but from some of our work that we did in the Great Lakes region, this is an area where we can see these kind of physical kind of ridge agricultural fields still preserved on the ground today. This is because this area was being used up until the early 20th century and then used as logging. So instead of it being plowed like many of the fields that we have in New England, here in this area, this was used for logging areas. So trees were growing up preserving the actual topographic expression of these fields. And so this is actually going back to that Cape Cod, that buried cornfield on Cape Cod. And what I really like about it is this really awesome 90s image, which looks a little dated today. But what I love about it is that this was actually created through their radar surveys and is probably one of the best and only early published ideas that geophysics can be used, not just to find pre-contact sites in New England, but also for indigenous agricultural fields as well. Unfortunately, they don't have any of the raw data published or any of the supplementals, so we just have this kind of image. So I'm taking this was from this as success, but it's something that I've been working on to try to see if I could find as well. And so why does this matter? So this directly matters because what I'm interested in is the actual settlements and stuff too, about the village debate, which these are kind of the 4 models of things that are going on. So the first one that we have that's been pretty well rejected, which is kind of known as like the CC hypothesis, is that there was no extensive agriculture here in the Northeast and New England prior to European contact, or just existing right about European contact. And this has to do with the actual environmental constraints of frost zones in the area. And then the second one, which was proposed in 2002, that seems to be holding a lot of ground with many archaeologists, was proposed by Elizabeth Chilton in 2002 about this mobile farming communities that are roaming the area as well. And then 3, there's this dispersed villages sites, which to me is very similar to the second one, but the idea that there are these from Rhode Island kind of succinct, kind of fully sedentary areas where people are also participating in agriculture. And then 4, which is kind of the full palisaded woodland villages that we see elsewhere in the Great Lakes by Hassan Saab, is this idea that these large, concentric, huge palisaded villages could exist within this area, but we haven't seen them due to preservation issues and the years of colonization. Personally, a lot of the works that's going on too is really suggesting that it's been 2 or 3, but there hasn't been really that much new form of evidence that's been suggesting elsewhere. And the reason why is because if you look at the actual understanding of known house sites within the region, this evidence is actually quite small. So I love this paper from 2019 by Farley et al. And this involves an entire review of the known house sites up into published house sites known within the Northeast. And one of the things they're looking about is very similar to when they're looking at is the introduction of corn, about whether this has been an event or not. Does this change when people are seemingly doing and adopting maize agriculture on the housing style? And so this is kind of really interesting. What I love about this too is like looking at number 16 and 17, which is up in the upper Connecticut River Valley. 17 is considered the Fairleigh County longhouses, which should be just up the road from here too. And if you look at the description, it's this kind of long 30 meters to 50 meter long paleosols filled with artifacts that are eroding out from the bank of the Connecticut River. And then even more importantly, 16, which also is the Skitchawag site. And for people who work in this area too, it's really important. It's got some also very early dated corn, not as old as the stuff that we see at the Ingalls site north, but also what's really important is 2 very clear profiled excavated house sites, which has been critical to my understanding of how to locate and find indigenous architecture in this region. If you guys have been keeping up with kind of things that have been happening recent or noticing that there's some gaps, sites that are missing from here clearly is the Hunter site, as well as there's also been a recent site found on the Winooski as well, where they found about a 20-meter long longhouse that was published in 2021. So this could still have some updating, but what I really like is even on the Connecticut River, these house sites are different styles of architecture as well. So this kind of goes into where our project is going now too. So this is our first kind of project where we started to test geophysical surveys to try to see if we can find any of these sites. This is the Great Oxbow District of the Connecticut River. And why it's important is because through the ethnohistorical record, this is the location of Cowes, which is known by the Abenaki communities today and of the past as a very important spot. We know about it existing in also the colonial record because of the location of a French mission. And this was also an area known during the 17th century as an area that could be used as refuge for other Algonquin communities in southern New England who are fleeing due to colonial violence. So this has been like well documented, and this is why we kind of chose this area to do this work, is because it's been well known in the historic record about for a settlement in this area. So these are the 3 techniques. I didn't want to kind of bore you guys with how all these techniques work, but just to show that we've done resistivity, magnetometry, and ground penetrating radar. This is all the same 20 meter by 20 meter plot. And you can see that in each of them that they showcase different forms of evidence that occurred. And what I really want you to point out is in the ground penetrator, you can see this nice big circular circle here, which is kind of our first key that there's probably the kind of our first clear anomaly that we found in the surveys. Pointing back to magnetometry, one of the big reasons why we're doing this is because through Newcomb funding, our lab was able to get a kind of multi-sensor gradiometry unit that's on a cart-based system. And so this is a really big way that we wanted to see to test to see if how this could be used to find these features. And what you can see, especially from this right picture here, is that it's littered with these dipoles. So there's tons of magnetic features all throughout here. And when we went to go test them, we realized that this is a lot of 20th century trash that's being subbed here too. So kind of land use of much more recent trash that's been kind of dispersed and spread throughout the field, obfuscating anything of kind of indigenous or prior to European contact sites within it. And we can see there are some anomalies that kind of look like possible architecture up here too. When excavating, we did find this nice kind of broken biface. But what those features actually are, when looking at them, the radar, are actually the local geology that's involved there too. So the granite in this set too is magnetic, which is kind of washing out any of the other features within it. So back to radar. So the whole point of this is to show that what we've kind of come to terms is that radar is the best way for us to find these sites here along the Connecticut River. And from that one anomaly that we saw too that was circular, we were trying to see if there's more kind of features like that. And they're all kind of faint. I'll point them out here in these kind of red circles here too. But there's these 3-meter long kind of circular depressions that we found along this former channel here. And we realized that from looking at everything to try to see if there is architecture, that these might be the best chances of seeing what these features are. And because of the lack of published geophysical surveys within this area, we were kind of, the landowners let us excavate it. And this was kind of a big way to kind of ground truth and see what these anomalies are firsthand. And kind of here's the results on the left. So what we see here is we see a 3-meter long kind of depression with a big thick charcoal line underneath. And it was very exciting because what we saw is that we're not creating artifacts within the radar, that these are true features. And that our understanding is exactly what these features are, is we were considering them as possible house sites based off of what we're seeing that's been excavated here at the Skitchawag site too. So this is that house basin that I mentioned earlier too, that's about the same dimensions here. What's different about these, obviously, is they have storage pits to the side of them, which our feature does not have. And what's also different about ours is that when we excavated ours, it was sterile. There was a complete void of artifacts within it. But from additional testing outside of it, we were able to find fire-cracked rock feature, most likely a hearth, as well as flakes as well. So there are indigenous artifacts surrounding this feature, just not within it, which is fine and makes sense for some of the other known excavated houses in the Northeast, especially in northern New York. So this brings up a question. We're very excited about this, but still it's one of those things where because there was not very clear artifacts within it and lack of kind of published geophysical surveys, we really wanted to put our attention to this site here. So this is Skitchawag, and this is kind of where I'm going to end on kind of like new information and novel information about what I've been working on and kind of really excited to share with you. So we did a radar survey. We did a 40 meters by 150 meter long survey. And why we're doing it is for this. Okay, so I'm just going to put it in. It's like really important. What was found here, the site was on the Connecticut River. In the 1980s, a boater was going by and noticed skeletal remains eroding from the bank of the river. So this was spurred a series of my understanding of about from 1987 to 1990 excavations all along in salvage archaeology that was able to uncover these two house sites. And because of this, we kind of know a real detailed understanding of the dates and understanding what this site is. But what's interesting is that what's really important is the fact that there's these two known house sites here too. So one of the issues with understanding of the possibilities of large village settlements is that we only have singular house sites. Sometimes the occasion we have two like this, but there's never been more than that at all found within the Woodland period in this region. And so we went out to do it. We did an orthomosaic. We did a DEM to see if there's any topographic features. We did everything is like to georeference to make sure that we have accuracy if we want to recover everything. And then here are the results. And here's what I'm really excited about. So you can see multiple different sites along the way, as well as we still did magnetometry just to test to make sure. And you can see with similar results that the magnetometry is a little bit harder to uncover. But what I want to point out from tier 2 is you can already kind of start to see multiple circular features and depressions within this survey. And then here is also how it lines up with the prior excavations that have occurred as well. And what's really important is this feature here too, both of them too, kind of show how the bank of the river has eroded over time. So this big circular feature here after being georeferenced was where the known burial was. And so you can also see where 3 and 4, these are the profiles of those house sites here. So those are just at the cusp of the river. And we can see how long, where they did also these small impressions too, were half-meter long, trouble testing to not too deep as well, that don't line up with other kind of circular features along. So we know that what we're seeing are not just the former units excavated by past archaeologists. And so here's just a close-up of one of the slices that I'm personally most excited about. And it's because of the multitude of these depressions throughout there too. And based off the sizes, that they're roughly around the same exact size of the known excavated house at Skitchewag, as well as smaller ones too that could be additional storage pits, and also other features too that are still like left to be determined. So for example, a box over here too is a long 10-meter kind of survey that potentially kind of, we don't really have a consistent thing of like that translates to this region, but when I first saw it too, it kind of reminds me of kind of dance rings and other kind of circular rings seen in the Greater Lakes and the other parts of Eastern North America. And so for me, this is like really exciting because it goes back to this idea that we know that we have core near 2. We don't have this idea of what's going on with kind of the settlements. And so, but we have here in this evidence too, in the geophysical surveys, that there's actually a much larger anthropogenic features and changes happening within this area, within this river valley that hasn't been seen or documented before. And so this is kind of the crux of my kind of research and dissertation work, is that we can actually use this in geophysical data set as a way to kind of prove and show the Northeast itself too does have this kind of more disturbed landscape that exists, that doesn't necessarily kind of go with either the pollen record or other things too, but this is a whole other own data set that should be used and really like taken seriously as a way to expand our knowledge of what's happening here. So Skitchewag's already really famous because it's got this 2 known house sites, or famous at least to us New England archaeologists. But now here too, we can actually see that we should be using geophysics and using these surveys at known sites as well, because we're clearly missing things in test excavations and the way how we've been approaching archaeology in the past as well. And doing this actually shows Skitchewag is not just a site with 2 known house sites, but actually an area that could be filled with many more house sites, including much more storage pits and understanding of possible sedentarism in this region. So here's some of my references, as well as I have extended other bibliographies if anyone else is interested or wants to know a little bit more about kind of the work and research that I'm working on. And then just for thanks, especially just for you guys for listening to me kind of rant about my work, as well as the landowners as well, especially Ken and Young of Skitchewag too, who let us do an extensive amount of work prior to corn being planted there. So yeah, with that, I'm willing to take any questions. And yeah. Thank you so much for listening to me. Yeah. Yeah.
At the Eagle site, it's also notable for the presence of St. Lawrence River potteries.
Yes. Yeah.
And that, I think, is a significant affiliate to the Maize, because they had a substantial maize agriculture on St. Lawrence River Plain. And it's possible, I suppose, that there was some interaction between St. Lawrence River and the River Connecticut, and possibly other things coming down with it.
Yeah, so that's that model. I think I've been seriously considering more and more, because there's kind of these kind of models of how corn moves through it as well, and it makes sense a lot, especially because kind of understandings of the ethnohistoric record of how, and just like this deep understanding that like it's been, especially in northern New England, that the Algonquin communities are just doing hunter-gatherers, they're not sitting down, they're mobile the entire time, that possibly this agriculture we're seeing here too is either from this other interaction or another community coming down. I think that involves a lot more work, but also it suggests like why we're also seeing such a diverse architectural changes just within this region as well. The fact that we have these wigwams and like kind of said, these long houses as well. This easily I could see as being interpreted as like 2 different communities, possibly St. Lawrence Iroquois and tradition and Algonquin, and whether those differences actually are true, or it's up to just material culture wise, there's definitely that change, which I think is really great. I also think it's important too, when it comes to the maize that I didn't mention here, is just you know, our understanding of, we could also have another model where we have large kind of concentric groupings of house sites all in one area that are sedentary, or and not do this agriculture as well. This is well known in other parts of you know, especially Pacific Northwest and other parts of the world. As well as we can also have really extensive agriculture and not sedentary villages, which we see as translations in the Great Lakes regions with some of the communities. Even in Day's Handbook of the Handbook of Native Americans, Western Abenaki, claims that his records showcase that Abenaki were planting a lot of corn and then just leaving it. This to me seems a little bit confusing unless you've like hunted all the deer and other things that are possibly going to like take these crops and such. But there hasn't been too much evidence or like support. Like it's been those same citations have been kind of talked about over and over again, but actually evidence for that is not as strong.
And one of the
Yeah.
styles of pottery was to feed the name, the representation of corn cobs around the shoulders of the pots, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. I think it's really fascinating, and like I think this is one of the things too. Is like I've questioned why the oldest corn date is from this area, and I really think that this to me is a real translation of the possibility that there's been extensive maize agriculture in here. It would make sense. We know from like other ways of domestication and like the roots for stuff too that we'd have this like nice river plain that's been like well disturbed and like perfect for kind of we wouldn't need to do burnings along this area because it would already be cleared and pretty easily adapted for agriculture. So I think like Oswald's and sub two is really great work. It adds a lot of questions of like why did we have this idea of controlled burnings, but we wouldn't necessarily need to have it within this river valley at all. And I think the idea that the fact that they don't see those burnings is not kind of truth to show that this agriculture didn't exist. And I think with the ceramics too, like if we had this like going back and doing phytolith analysis on it too would be really important. Like that one has corn, we have corn kernels there too, but there's so much ceramics being collected that even with other macro remains not being collected, we should be able to obtain phytoliths from these things too. And I think we could really start pushing these dates back and really open our understanding that the Northeast maybe not be as different or lags within this kind of maize debate versus the rest of Eastern North America. And I think as time goes on, we can really test these things. So, yeah. Yes.
I think one reason you may not find a lot of charcoal evidence of that kind of what you think of as burning.
Yeah.
The spring burning, it's all burning the stuff that's on the ground. You're not going to create a lot of charcoal there. And in terms of Deerfield mass, the Indians were burning there and the settlers were burning there at least until 1749 on a regular basis. Actually picked that up in the town meeting records when two guys are warned beforehand. They're responsible for burning, but they're responsible for notifying the people in the town so that they can burn the area around the town fence. So that the fence won't burn down. The area is burned over.
Yeah. So I know a bit about the Deerfield kind of burning stuff too, and kind of within the kind of like Massachusetts, kind of middle Connecticut River Valley. You know, these things are kind of based off of contemporary state lines. But one of the things that I think is important to that with the Oswald was they're picking up charcoal past this moment of the 16th and 17th century. And so what's interesting is prior to that, they don't see this. So it's interesting that those types of controlled burnings are seen after European contact and stuff that like in this area and like kind of the start of this early colonial period. You're not seeing it earlier, at least, you know, within the records that have been published, or it's been ignored by those sediment cores too, which is really interesting. Like talking to other people too, they just started 1800 because they don't think that there's going to be radical landscape changes in this area. Like they're already under that assumption. And I think this is something that's really happening within our understanding of almost like an STS talk about in this area is that we have these assumptions about how this landscape is already. And so we're just perpetuating those current assumptions. We're not actually going back and testing why these things are here. And so I think like for this example, like it's a really good example where we have this area which known two house sites, but actually like there are way more house sites here too. And I'm very confident on there too. It's not just within the slice maps, it's very clear within the radiograms too, which are kind of boring and tough to kind of tease out for the public audience, but I'd be happy and really excited to kind of share and publish that data because I think it really kind of opens up our understanding of what settlement could be. And it's not necessarily going to be these big concentric palisaded villages, but just a grouping of houses within this area, similar to kind of the diversity that we're seeing in New York with Bertrand Thompson's work there too. So yeah. Yeah.
All of the native deeds, however you want to interpret those, that were collected in the 17th century.
Yeah.
They're not by one group, they're by family groups. Most of the signatories that are selling the planting field, their planting field. And so that's going to, well, I'm sure they're not palisaded villages.
Yeah.
So you've got scattered family plots next to the agricultural field. The fields are a half an acre to an acre per family. So you're going to get that kind of scattered pattern you're seeing in your the ones you presented.
Yeah.
I like that concept in the sense that they may be dated from decades apart.
Yeah.
But repeated use of those fields over a couple of centuries is going to produce a pattern.
Yeah.
Produce a pattern like that.
I think so. The biggest thing that I've been working about is like, this is the great point that you put out. I'm really glad you did, which is the chronological question, right? So like, maybe this is not all being occupied at the same time, you know, and that would make it still one of these ideas where we're questioning about this idea of this anthropogenic paradigm and landscape. We're still seeing this changes over time about this continuous occupation and changing of the, like, we're literally changing the landscape and occupying these fields for a long period of time. But it would also be interesting too if we actually go back out there and get sediment cores and date them. And if these all end up being roughly dated around the same time, that even opens up even more exciting questions too. So I think that in the lowest impact of this, we can see that, yes, the landscape's been changed, it's been occupied, people have been occupying these fields and building continuously in the same spots over and over again. Great. I don't think that's like the most paradigm breaking, except now we have evidence for it, like clear concrete evidence. But what would be much more interesting is if these are actually all occupied at the same time. And what I'm really interested in is like kind of like other forms of architectural features too. So kind of this changes that we know about, thinking about looking kind of out a little bit and the connections between the St. Lawrence River Valley and the Great Lakes region, or even other parts of Eastern North America too as well. So we know that there was interaction and trade going on. And so it's really been frustrating where people constantly will ignore these or change that away too. So I'm hoping that we can look at these as one small impact, but really think about this as a broader impact of connecting this to other communities. So, yeah.
So I've worked at the Archeological office in the late 80s. They experienced a lot of people back when Jim Peterson's gang was doing the work at Skitchwalk. And I just want to say again, it's really exciting to see continued attention to that site and using more information out of us. Pleased with that. But also, I wanted to give a shout out to navigational archaeologists. A lot of the sites along the river there, Skitchwalk and that whole section, were recorded by a high school student, Tom Lade. And he's a local, Weathersfield upstream, and he was wandering the river banks and started finding these things. And was entirely just curious and self-taught. Somehow managed to get in touch with Joanna, and she kind of helped focus him, and he started recording the sites and systematically plotting them on maps and keeping this artifacts separate like that. And so a lot of the whole group of sites skitchwalking around that we wouldn't have known about except this curious local kid who got seized by the bug and was channeled in the right direction. We, as professional archaeologists, we never have a chance to find out about these sites. Not for him. So
yeah,
that's how the personal stories behind cool sites.
Yeah, no, that's really exciting. Yeah, it's kind of like the kind of opening thing too, just how they've been covered and stuff too. It's kind of an interesting portion. Yeah, and it's interesting too because as you get to go there and too, like when we were doing this work, because we go out there with all this technology, big survey equipment, the biggest thing people were like not interested in this, like the archaeology we're doing. They were like, you're not going to be developing this land. And I was like, no, like that's the last thing we want. Like we're not here to develop this land at all. And so I think just like continued work was really important. And even like while we're working up near Cowes and the Newberry area too, just there's I didn't talk about it, but like one of the things we did a public excavation there with the J-term students, and even the family members who've been playing on these fields their entire life didn't realize that just underneath them is this like incredible 3,000, 5,000 archaic site there. And so it just kind of shows that like we need to be kind of more public facing with these things too and get more people engaged with it. So yeah. Sorry, I don't know if I went over or not, but yeah. Oh, yep, there, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you have data from your remote sensing survey that indicates raised ridges and furrows rather than circular.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I haven't. So this is something that I need to go back and kind of look for kind of the agricultural style within it. Yeah, so you see within the Great Lakes, you see both the diversity of rich fields, which like we've done a lot of work up there with that. One of our colleagues, Madeline McFisher, has kind of been leading that work, and that should be push it'll be published hopefully soon. So take a look out for that. But what you also see in the Great Lakes region too, is you also see communities there too, especially on the interior side, do cornhill mounds as well. So you see a diversity both in there. The issue is why the cornhills in the Great Lakes regions aren't preserved as well as they have to be kind of maintained pretty extensively. And they're lost a lot in kind of the public information, like public LiDAR DEM stuff too. So we see a diversity there as well. The rich fields we don't see. I haven't seen them here in both our radar surveys or as well really in the kind of ethnohistorical record on that. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen that in any of the data that I've researched. But what I have seen in our data that we could see is the changing of cloud fields throughout time as well that aren't pre-contact. So for example, in I don't have a photo of it, but you can actually see like the plow scars going the other direction. And so while we're doing radars and looking at the slices, you could actually see how the tilled soil has changed over time. So you can see kind of how it's being moved because what radar is doing is changing the dielectrics of the soil. So as soil is being piled up differently and plowed and such, this will all be preserved. But what you see is a very clear kind of historic plow zone that you can see these things being preserved in, and then a layer underneath it that's this pre-contact, like pre-colonial, like indigenous landscape underneath it.
I get a chance to contact Dave Stimmus in Vermont.
I have not talked to Dave Zinnis personally. No, I've read a lot of all of his stuff. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah.
Back in the 80s, he was doing remote sensing up there in Lower Coas.
Yeah,
He found long linear features.
Yeah.
That were definitely man-made. They're not depositional.
Yeah. So I can take a look at them. I've read all the kind of like Vermont Archaeological Society, like radar kind of surveys. There's like 3 or 4 of them that have been published, but it's really sad that a lot of that data set hasn't been like publicly available to me who's been trying to do it. So that's why we have to like go back to these sites, which has actually been really fruitful, but also it's a little frustrating because for a long time too, people like were dismissing that like radar and what sense it could even work for indigenous landscape stuff, that it only could work for this kind of colonial early historical settlements and buildings. And that's just not true, and not true for anywhere else in North America as well. So there's been kind of dismissal, and like we're very fortunate to be close in New Hampshire too to like GSSI and Peter Leach and very famous kind of geophysical remote sensings. And I think it's changing rapidly, but still, even with that close in proximity to kind of some of the the best companies out there, the published stuff on there is very minimal. The most recent one was there's a couple like radar surveys in Maine that got published that looked at the deposition and preservation of shell middens. So it's a real plea that like we can do a lot and we're trying to do a lot, but you guys act like we need more of this to be done.